it's been a great 10 years. It's been one of my favorite things to do every year. So thank you to everyone who supported that throughout those years. Before I begin to talk about the state of the island, I want to just kind of get a sense of how the room's feeling. So we have a couple questions from Slido. We have 2 questions from Slido. So this is just, if you want to put in a word or a couple words, just tell us what you think the most significant challenges affecting Vancouver Island's economy in 2025 are. This is part of that becoming more social media, getting sort of a little bit more interactive. Yep. Okay, thanks. So we're seeing a lot about uncertainty, housing, affordability, a little bit about tariffs, healthcare, okay, transportation, regulation, nice. All the things that we've been talking about here for the last few years, and some of the things I'm going to talk about today on it. Okay. So I think we still have a few more. We'll give it about just 1 or 2 more things. Okay. So, housing still continues to be on top of everybody's mind. We're seeing cost of living. Those seem to be the big ones. We're not talking about trade. So that's good, because I'm not going to talk a lot about Trump today. So that's good to know. We have another question. So if we want to go to the next question on it. This is really just to understand how you feel about the outlook for your organization over the next 12 to 18 months. I want to see how people feel like the economic conditions are. See if it matches the data. We did the same question last year, and I think most people had, we had similar results, as I recall. People are feeling relatively confident. We have stable or good conditions. Not too many people on the either end of the spectrum, so people are looking really about, where things are, stability, good, positive outlook. So hopefully you'll still feel that way after what I have to say. Okay, so if we can go back to the slides. So the theme of this year's summit is Vision 2050. So I thought it would be worthwhile spending a few minutes reviewing how Vancouver's island has evolved over the last 25 years, talking a little bit about sort of where we are today, and then start, laying the groundwork and thinking, what are look at a few of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about what is that foundation we need to put in place to ensure prosperity for the next 25 years to 2050. So let's start with population growth, which is something we always talk about. So population growth is a key factor in economic prosperity. And here on Vancouver Island, it's long been a very attractive place for people to live, work, and play. So over the past 25 years, the population has grown by over a third. So that's 250,000 people. So we have 250,000 more people here on Vancouver Island today than we did 25 years ago. Almost 60% of that growth, or about 130,000, has occurred in the last 10 years. And so what is driving that population growth is a combination of people from other parts of British Columbia moving to Vancouver Island, and people from other parts of Canada coming here. We also had a bit of international immigration, but it was really Canadians were moving to Vancouver Island. in terms of why they were moving to Vancouver Island, there's really two stories here. Sort of in that early first 10 years between about 2001 and 2010, we saw a lot of people coming here to get ready to retire because the weather on Vancouver Island is much more attractive than other places in Canada, especially if you're retiring. But sometime around 2014, we started to see a shift. And we started to see, in addition to people coming with the idea of retiring, we're also seeing a lot of young people come to Vancouver Island, and they were coming to Vancouver Island because there was opportunities here. Alberta's economy was slowing as we saw sort of the oil market sort of slow down and commodity markets had come down. And the whole build out of the oil sands was complete. Ontario was trying to reinvent itself after the global financial crisis, and so people saw opportunities here on Vancouver Island, and that's why they were coming here. And that's sort of been the trend that's continued through the pandemic and through now. We're still seeing people come here for the opportunities. It's a mix of young people, but also people approaching retirement. And so what's happened to the age distribution is that between 2001 and 2020, which is, I'll put 2024 up in a little bit later in the presentation, what we've seen is our population has gotten older. The share of people aged 70 and over has grown from 12% of the population to over 17% in that 20-year period. And we have fewer kids, okay, and fewer kids, which is our future workforce. And so that means that without continued migration of young people, our workforce of the future is going to be smaller. If we look at what the structure of the economy looked like, what you see is that the composition of the economy has also changed. So this is employment by sector, which is a pretty good proxy for what the underlying economic base looks like. And what we see is that starting in 2006, I couldn't find data for 2001, but 2006 would be a pretty close proxy for 2001. But what you notice is that the percentage of employment on Vancouver Island that's dedicated to goods production, so that would be forestry, fishing, aquaculture, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, mining, has declined, while the share of services has increased. And in particular, the share of employment in the public sector, so publicly funded services, which would be education, healthcare, and government, has increased. We've been talking a lot about the increase in government employment recently, but guess what? That's not a recent phenomenon. This has been happening for at least 20 years, where we've seen government employment increasing and sort of our goods production decreasing as a share of employment. Now, when you look at the absolute numbers, what you see is that employment in goods production is pretty stable across the period. So we still have about 70,000 people on Vancouver Island employed in goods production. The composition has changed a little bit. We're not seeing growth in forestry. We've actually seen big declines in forestry, but we've seen increases in construction, but overall the number's there. But services have really grown a lot. So that's why that share of employment in the goods sector has gone down. So if I'd given a State of the Island presentation in 2009, what I would have been talking about was how economic activity was slowing. There was significant uncertainty because of the global financial crisis. And businesses on Vancouver Island were facing challenges related to changing demographics, high transportation costs, and shortages of skilled labor. Sound familiar? Okay. 10 years ago, when we gave the first State of the Island report, the themes were around improvements in the forest sector as the world economy was recovering from the global financial crisis, uncertainty in aquaculture due to a moratorium on finfish licenses, and increases in the rate of population growth as those people started coming from Alberta and Ontario for those opportunities. Tourism was also starting to take off due to favorable exchange rates. International students were being courted as to provide a future labor supply and some funding for our post-secondary system. And we were seeing the start of growth in knowledge-based sectors such as technology. Since then, we've seen the footprint of the forest sector shrink. The last operating mine on Vancouver Island closed last year. There's no longer a mining sector here. And we've seen the film sector emerge. So that's one of those knowledge-based sectors. Aquaculture still faces a lot of uncertainty. The number of international students has declined, causing budget issues for post-secondary institutions. And tourism had a bit of a rough go during the pandemic, but appears to have recovered to sort of the same similar levels to what we saw around the pandemic. Globally, we've been through a series of shocks, which included the pandemic, a war in Europe, a realignment of our reevaluation of our trade relationship with China from the West, and now the US administration is attempting to upend the entire global system. And through all of this, we've continued to see people move to Vancouver Island, and that's been a key factor in Vancouver Island's economic story. Last year when I was here, the discussion we had was around how we were at an inflection point, and we had a choice to make. Over-reliance on population growth and housing construction as an economic driver had, combined with low levels of private sector investment, had put us in a situation that was really not sustainable. Things might be okay in the short term, but it was not sustainable in the long term. So without growth in our economic base that generates incremental tax revenues, our fiscal situation was expected to deteriorate, and that has really important long-term implications for both our ability to maintain programs and services, but also our standard of living. So where are things today? Well, let's start with GDP. GDP is our standard measure of economic growth, and prior to the pandemic, BC's economy was growing at sort of that 2 to 3.5% annually, which is healthy for an advanced economy. This was driven by a combination of some private sector investment, but a lot of public sector investment in infrastructure. We also had significant immigration that I've been talking about from different parts of Canada, which was driving our housing and construction sector. Those factors were making BC one of the strongest economies in Canada, and we consistently outperformed our peers. In 2024, our real GDP was about almost 11% higher than it was in 2019. But since then, things have changed. Since the initial bounce back after the pandemic of 2022, 2023, our annual economic growth has been about 1 to 1.5%, which is really low, and it would be actually considered quite poor for an advanced economy. In 2025, we did see a bit of an increase relative to 2024. We are expect to see a bit of an increase, but that's really because of some moving of some goods across the border in response to Trump. But at the end of the day, things are not looking good, and BC has gone from being one of the strongest performing economies in Canada to the weakest. Okay? And this is really driven by our reliance on population growth as an economic driver and affordability. Okay? So if we look at what industries are contributing to growth in BC, you see one of those cracks that I've been talking about in the foundation that I was talking about last year that I've continued to talk about through the year. And that's one of those cracks in the foundation upon which our long-term prosperity is built. So between 2019 and 2024, annual growth in BC was about 2.4%. That's compound annual growth rate on it. And if we look at the sectors that were performing at higher growth rates, we see information communications and technology, and telecommunications. That is where our tech sector is. So that's a lot of programming, software, as well as some of the manufacturing of those kind of goods. Finance and construction were also in the 3 to 4% that were above that average of 2.42%. Industrial production, which is where we find our goods sector, it was actually negative, okay, to flat. So there. And then there's the public sector. This has grown by about 3.7% annually, which is above average of private sector, of the economy as a whole, and better than most private sector industries. Construction, which was growing at higher rates than average. Well, if we look at what that growth was composed of, a lot of it was being driven by engineering construction. So that's the red bar there. And that, on the right-hand side, the red bar is about things like Site C, Coastal GasLink pipeline, and LNG Canada. Those things are, those major projects, are all pretty much wrapping up. And we don't have a big pipeline of major projects that are about to start. So we're going to expect to see construction start to slow. And so what this tells us is that we're not producing a lot of things that are bringing money into the province from the outside. Rather, we're producing things to support the local population. And this is great in the short term, but we also have a housing shortage, which means people can't find places to live, and they're spending increasing amounts on shelter. We aren't seeing significant private sector investments or business formation. So, and well, at the same time, our public sector is expanding. When you look at Vancouver Island, you see these same trends. The outlook for key industries is mixed. Those resource sectors that have traditionally been the backbone of the economy are continuing to shrink. Weak market conditions, increases in softwood tariffs by the US, and just regulatory strangulation is, hammering our forest industry. I don't know what else I need to say. I think everybody's familiar with how badly our forest industry has been performing on the island. The future of farm salmon is uncertain because we have been, the decision's been made that it's closed containment, and it's not clear that that's economically viable. So there, we don't know what's going to happen with farm salmon, which for a lot of rural communities is one of the key industries. And so, but nobody's willing to make investments because of all that uncertainty. On a more positive note, tourism is continuing to perform reasonably well, and we're seeing consistent growth in the knowledge economy. So that's things like tech and the film industry. So if we look at population, we've heard a lot about immigration and immigration policy recently. Well, population on Vancouver Island is right now, it's over 920,000 people. And it's still continuing to grow. So BC is seeing really low growth rates of population this year, but people still are coming to Vancouver Island, just not at the same rate they were previously. If we look at the sources of population growth, we've seen a bit of a shift here. So deaths are higher than births, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to anyone, given the age distribution that I showed you earlier on it. But what has changed, and that hasn't changed, but what has changed is sort of where people are coming from. Before, we had people coming from other parts of Canada. That is actually, we're seeing the reverse. We're actually seeing people leave Vancouver Island for other parts of Canada. Where people are still coming, where Canadians are still coming, is from other parts of BC. So we've still seen some interprovincial migration, some intra-provincial migration. We're seeing people leave. And we're seeing, growth in international immigration. And so what we saw is there's that big increase that in population that has occurred, like that we had the 9.7% that year. A lot of that was driven by temporary residents, so non-permanent residents. That's the biggest source of population growth since the pandemic on Vancouver Island. And so that would be temporary foreign workers and students. Well, we've had changes to and those things put a lot of pressure on our infrastructure, on our housing infrastructure, on our healthcare infrastructure, and a lot of other services. And so we've seen a change in immigration policy. And one of the things about when you look at who those people were that were in those categories, a lot of it was agriculture workers and lower skill workers where we're not able to find Canadians to do the jobs. So there was people coming in to clean hotel rooms. Because if you're in the tourism, if you run a hotel and you don't have someone to clean the hotel rooms, you can't rent that hotel room out, which affects your revenue. But you can't find anyone to do those kind of jobs. We also saw an increase in the number of people coming in for skilled trades because we have not been investing in enough capacity, training capacity, and people have not been going into the skilled trades at the same rate. So they were starting to see more and more people coming in under some of the skilled trades and for healthcare. With the changes that we're looking at immigration policies, a lot of that is slowing down. And it will alleviate some of the pressures on housing in the short term, but it isn't necessarily going to help us with the labor shortages that those people were helping to fill. So if we look at the labor market, what we're starting to see is that short-term indicators suggest we're starting to head into a slowdown. So vacancy rates are below 2019 levels, and we're seeing increases in unemployment. So Vancouver Island does have one of the lowest unemployment rates in Canada. And it is below the provincial average right now. It's about 6.4%. So in Q3, we're still below the provincial average. But when we look at participation rates, what we're starting to see is that they're starting to decline marginally. And when participation rates start to decline, and with some of the other indicators we're seeing, it suggests that we have weakening economic conditions and people are getting discouraged. So people aren't able to find jobs, so rather than keep looking, they're exiting the labor market. If we look at overall employment trends, what we see that there's roughly 600,000 more jobs on Vancouver Island than there was in 2019, which is good. So that suggests that the labor market has, for the most part, been able to absorb the increases in population. However, if you look a little bit deeper, what you see that most of the employment growth has been in publicly funded sectors. This is education, healthcare, social assistance, and government. In the private sector, where we have seen growth is in professional and scientific services, which is where you'd find some of the things like, accounting, consulting, engineering, legal, things to support businesses and the local economy, but you're also going to find some of your tech sector. We're also seeing it in information, culture, and recreation, and in some trade on it. So those things are all really about, supporting the local population. So there is the knowledge economy, which is an export sector, but it's still a relatively small part of the overall growth in employment. So here again, we're seeing that increasing dependence on the public sector and limited growth in export sectors that generate income from outside the island. So the most recent data suggests that the ratio of public sector to private sector jobs is 2-to-1. So for every private sector job we've added 2 public sector jobs, or publicly funded jobs. Okay. If we look at business counts, what you see is that, there are just over 28,000 businesses on Vancouver Island with employees, and about 70 without. So over the last 5 years, since before the pandemic, we've added about 9,000 to 10,000 businesses. Half of those appear to be in short-term, appear to be business licenses or something set up to do short-term rentals. Only about 800 or 900 of them were businesses with employees, and a lot of those were in construction. And professional, scientific, and services. We're also seeing growth in the number of businesses in healthcare and social assistance, which is one of those publicly funded sectors on it. So here again, that reliance on publicly funded services and housing is showing up in business formation and business growth on Vancouver Island. If we start to look at the business environment, what we see that bankruptcies, these are business bankruptcies, between 2024 and 2023, business bankruptcies actually declined, but they're well above where they were pre-pandemic. So far, year to date, it looks like we're going to be sort of similar in terms of the number of business bankruptcies to what we had in 2024 and this year. It's important to note that these numbers are only going to show businesses that had assets to distribute, that needed to do some sort of disbursement of assets. It doesn't include the number of businesses that had no assets and just shut down on it. And this is something we talked about last year. What's new this year is that we're also seeing insolvency statistics, or consumer insolvencies, rising. They're still well below where they were pre-pandemic, but we're seeing these numbers start to increase. And what's behind that is what's happening in the labor market. So as long as we had strong labor market conditions, and if people lost their job, they could find a new one, they were still able to meet their obligations. But with weakening labor market conditions, pullback in hiring, and layoffs that are happening, people aren't able to find jobs, and so they're no longer able to meet their obligations. And so we're seeing insolvency statistics increase. And then there's housing. This is a key driver of economic activity on Vancouver Island. And while price growth is slowing, a single-family home is still almost $1.2 million in Victoria and over $800,000 on other parts of the island. Okay? When it comes to apartments and townhomes, they're a little bit cheaper, but they're still sitting around $500,000 in most places. And, while that's lower than what you find in the Lower Mainland, that's generally not that's not what I would consider affordable for most people, particularly young people just starting out and trying to get their first job, especially when you have weak labor market conditions. I know, if you were graduating from post-secondary this spring, you probably had a really hard time finding a job because firms weren't hiring. And if you found a job, it probably wasn't in your sector. And so those people are struggling already because of high housing, like high rental costs. And that's going to have some serious implications in the future if they're not able to sort of get started, get out of their parents' basement, and start to work, develop their skills, and build up some assets. So that has long-term implications for us going forward. Rental accommodations aren't that much better. Rents have increased by between 40 and 60% between 2019 and 2024. And some of that's been in Victoria, but we're also seeing really significant increases here in Nanaimo, Campbell River, and Courtenay. So this is kind of a widespread thing. It's no longer just concentrated in those urban centers. There has been some, as immigration has slowed and we've seen less pressure and there's not as many international students here, we are seeing some of these rents start to come down, but they're still significantly higher than they would have been 5 years ago on it. And, we're not building, and when we look at things like building permits, and we're hearing a lot of talk about building housing, and there's all this housing coming, but the reality is when I put up that slide earlier that had the construction on it, you saw that residential construction was actually declining. So, even though we're talking about building all this housing, we're not actually building all this housing. We're seeing a lot of projects get canceled. A lot of the insolvencies we're seeing in businesses, construction companies. So we're not building housing that's going to help us address our housing affordability challenges because we're actually seeing construction start to decline. So if we look at GDP per capita, this is just a rough measure of productivity. Here on Vancouver Island, GDP per capita is lower than the rest of BC, and it's lower than the rest of Canada. Part of that is because of because we have Victoria, which is the seat of government, and just how product output from government is measured. So it is lower, partly because of that. And if we look at GDP per worker, we also see that it is much lower. And that's because there's a relatively larger service industry producing lower value services that are just, serving the local population. Our resource sectors haven't been growing. They're not exporting a lot, which those sectors tend to have higher value goods. They tend to be more competitive, but they're in decline. So that's part of what is happening with Vancouver Island's productivity on it. So what does that mean for where we are today? Where we are today. Last year we had talked a little bit about, well, things are going to be okay in the short term, but we need to do something in the longer term. I would say today we're kind of at the beginning of where we actually really need to do something, because the foundation upon which our prosperity is built is starting to crumble. And we're starting to see those indicators show that. And that's not just because of what's happening with the US administration. This is primarily because of the past choices we've made. So I do need to talk a little bit about the US administration. And as of like about 15 minutes ago, my understanding is that trade talks with Canada are still on hold. We'll see if that still holds for the rest of my talk, but that's kind of like that's kind of what's creating a lot of the uncertainty we're thinking about. When we saw on that first Slido about the uncertainty, it's that kind of an approach that is creating a lot of the uncertainty we're dealing with. So I think it's important that we spend some time reviewing the role of trade in our economy on it. So how dependent are we on trade? Well, household consumption accounts for about 60% of the economy. So that's the things that we day-to-day, housing, transportation, food, entertainment. Export to other countries account for about 25% of the economy, and interprovincial trade, so exports to other provinces, are approximately 10 to 12% of our economy. And if we look at where those exports go, this is Canada versus BC. And so this was sort of before the whole Trump thing. Historically, what we saw is Canada's exporting somewhere between $600 and $700 billion worth of goods. About 75% of it goes to the US. Most of that is energy and automotive. We also have forestry products, which are important there as well. If we look at BC, we export about $55 billion annually, and we're far less dependent on the US than the rest of Canada. Okay? So we're less exposed to some of these other areas. But we're more exposed to Asia. So China accounts for about 16% of BC's. Or prior to 2024, there was about 16% of BC's exports. Other Asia was almost 20%, and then the rest of the world is about 10.4%. So what is it that we're sending to the US from BC? Well, it's mostly raw materials, so wood, food, and other intermediate goods that go into their manufacturing sector. So when Trump puts tariffs on those, it has an immediate impact on consumers in the US because the price of their goods go up. Now, what about imports? Roughly half of what we import comes from the US, and in BC, it's closer to a third, which once again means we're less exposed to what's happening with the US than other parts of Canada. But because of the collateral damage of some of the other things that the US is doing, our relationship with China is fractured right now too. We joined the US in putting tariffs on electric vehicles from China, and in retaliation, China decided, well, now's a really good time to retaliate, and so they've put some significant tariffs on some of our agricultural products. And that's not having the effect here in BC, but it is certainly affecting our producers of canola and pork, which is, on the prairie provinces. So it's not just the US that we're seeing realignment of trade with and some aggressive trade policies, it's other countries as well as a result. So as of today, almost everything that goes to the US is still going across the border tariff-free because of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. So as long as it's compliant, for the most part, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, if it's compliant with CUSMA, it's going across the border at the same tariff rate. We don't know how long that's going to last. We know that Trump has announced last week, because he didn't like some ads that Doug Ford ran, quoting Ronald Reagan accurately, that we're going to see 10% tariffs. Who knows when those are going to hit, but that's in addition to other tariffs he's already announced that we're waiting to be. But right now, we're still covered by CUSMA. That is being renegotiated. It's up for a review and renegotiation. So sometime next spring, we should have an indication of whether we will still have a CUSMA agreement or not. The consensus appears that, we're probably going to be facing some sort of tariff in any new agreement, but we'll see what happens. Now, if we look at what's happened with exports, we see that in Q1 and Q2, so this is 2024 versus 2025 for the first basically 5 months, what we saw is that our exports year to date really haven't declined yet, right? So we saw people move a lot of stuff as soon as Trump was elected and started talking about tariffs again. We saw a lot of inventory get moved across the border, both ways. And what that did is it boosted our GDP in the fourth quarter. But it also meant that, our exports stayed strong. And we saw that up until about, the first part of January. Well, the new administration was still getting settled. And so Q1 was a little bit higher, Q2 was a little bit lower, but on net, we haven't really seen a big decrease in our exports. But what we have seen as a result of that is people aren't rebuilding those inventories. And so in places like Ontario, you're seeing big job losses. So a lot of the job losses we've seen across Canada have occurred in Ontario, and they're related to auto tariffs, as well as the steel and aluminum tariffs. And that is because people are trying to navigate this uncertainty and they're not sure what to do. You may have heard some of the announcements about increases. We've increased trade to Europe by 50%, or we've increased trade to such and such by 70%. Don't be misled by the high growth rates. Those numbers are really, really small. Okay? Mexico is like 1% of our trade. So a 50% increase in trade to Mexico is 0.5% in our trade. So it's not, those numbers aren't big. The US, as I showed when I said like 75% of the value of our exports go to the US is by far the largest trading partner we have. And regardless of what happens going forward, they are going to continue to be our largest trading partner just because of proximity on it. And so this realignment of trade that we're talking about is not something that's going to happen overnight, and it's going to take a long time. And if we've listened to what our Prime Minister Carney's been talking about, is he's trying to reduce our reliance on the US market so that we're only sending 50% of our stuff there. And that's not expected to happen quickly, so it's going to take some time. So in the short term, this means we're going to be facing some really difficult choices, and we're going to have to make some trade-offs. We've not been investing in things that improve our productivity, and so even without that threat from the US, as we've been talking about for the last year, there's a need to do things differently, unless we want to see our standard of living erode. With the trade situation, there's not a lot we can do in the short term, but when there's any time that there's a shock, that means that there's also an opportunity. And so that means in the longer term that if we choose to take action, there are lots of things we can do. And we're starting to see governments move on the things that are within their control. We're seeing efforts made to diversify our trading relationships and sign new trade agreements. We're seeing interprovincial trade barriers come down. But, and there is always a but in any of these, as I said, there's trade-offs. These changes are going to take time. And it's not just governments that need to do things differently. Businesses need to change how they are operating as well. So we need to be making investments in things that improve our productivity. We need to be making investments in training for our young people. And we need to be thinking about where we want to be, not where we were. Okay? So we've seen technology and services grow as a share of our economy. And that's true in most advanced economies. And that trend is going to continue regardless of what Trump does. And so there's a lot of opportunities when we think about things like AI and new technologies that we can build on. And there's been some really cool stuff done here on Vancouver Island around that. And so when we think about the path forward, what does the next 25 years look like? Well, population, which is one of the foundations of economic prosperity, population growth is projected to slow. So we're looking at a 13% increase as opposed to a 30% increase. So that's the projection. This is from BC Stats. If we look at the age distribution, we're looking, on the first bar there is 2024. So just under 20% of our population right now is over 70. By 2045, it's going to be almost a quarter of our population is going to be over 70. And so that means we need to be thinking about infrastructure investments and how we address things like housing needs, the provision of health care, and transportation services, as well as how we respond to a changing climate. Because just because Trump has decided climate change doesn't exist, doesn't mean that the climate's not changing. It doesn't mean that we're not facing forest fires and rising sea levels and all those different things that we've been talking about for the last few years. And so all these things are fundamental in building economic resilience, regardless of who our trading partners are. And so one of the things I would say here is, a lot of times people say, well, this time is different. But no, this time isn't different. This is the same things, a lot of these things, infrastructure investments, around housing, demographics, all these things. These are all things we were talking about 25 years ago. And they're all things that we have an influence over at the regional level. What is really different this time, it's the context that we're dealing with. We have AI is here, and it's here to stay. And how we use it presents an enormous opportunity, but it also comes with some significant risks with it. And so by investing in infrastructure, that's looking at things like AI and how we use it, and thinking about Indigenous reconciliation. These things are going to help us build resilience. The role that economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples plays is twofold. It's not just because it's the right thing to do, it's because it's good for everybody. If we can close the gap between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada, we're all going to benefit. And there is a significant amount that we can learn about moving forward in a way that's both sustainable and creates prosperity today and for future generations from our Indigenous partners. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn back to Slido, and before I have Julie come up and help me take some questions from the audience with one more question on it. So based on what I just said, I'd like to think about what do you see as the most significant opportunities for Vancouver Island over the next 5 years? 25 years is kind of hard to think about, but let's think about what do we think we should be doing over the next 5 years?
So we are actually at time, and you have a 30-minute networking break, but nobody wants to leave until we ask Susan a few questions. So on the same Slido app, while we're still getting these commentary pieces back about the next 5 to 10 years, there is a Q&A portion. So if you want to go ahead and type in a question or two. I literally will get to 2 of them, maybe 3. But if you want to ask Susan some questions, now's the time. And then you'll still have a bit of a break before the first session begins at 2 p.m.
I'm noticing tourism is one of the big things. And tourism is actually really interesting. I would agree that in the short term particularly, tourism is a huge opportunity. It's a way to, people are turning away from the U.S., and we've seen a lot of people coming to Canada this year and a lot of Canadians staying home. And that brings money into our regions. And it's a quick, short-term boost to the economy that you can build on. So I think we sometimes discount tourism, but tourism is an important part of economic resilience, particularly in the short term. And we have FIFA coming up next year, where we'll be hosting the World, which is a huge opportunity for us to encourage people to come to BC. In Canada. Okay. Ocean industries is another interesting opportunity. I think we're talking about that. There's a session, Julie, on the ocean industries?
There is a seaweed session this afternoon. Session.
Yeah. And then the aquaculture, some of our core forestry, aquaculture, manufacturing, those are still there, as well as seaweed. So
there's a fireside chat on aquaculture on Thursday. Hopefully I'm getting my schedule right.
Okay, and of course AI. I think AI is one of the most interesting applications to think about. I know there's a lot of people that are afraid of AI. I actually think AI's got tremendous potential to help us make work more interesting for people. And to help, but we need to think about how we're going to train people to use it. So
we have 3 AI sessions. One this afternoon, another one I think tomorrow, and then a fireside chat with Graham Truex and Leah Tremaine on Thursday. So lots of conversation around AI. Anything surprise you on this board?
No, I find it quite encouraging, because it's about things that are within our control and the things that we're laying the foundation for. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
How do you think manufacturing can support us? That's one that I'd like to lean into more. I mean, that's Island Good as part of manufacturing production. We think about it in the consumable sort of vein because we're here having lunch and it's all island good, but it does support producers and manufacturers around the region as well. And I'd love to see growth.
Yeah, no, I think manufacturing, when we think about manufacturing, the first thing our mind goes to is wood products. But manufacturing is more than just wood products. Manufacturing is about, we've got a huge food and beverage processing sector. We've got a large agricultural sector that we can build on and that we can use to create value-added goods with some of our primary inputs. So I think manufacturing has a lot of potential, for sure, if we look at how it fits into sort of some of our primary industries and supports those.
Are there any questions up in the Q&A yet for Susan? I can look at my phone too, maybe.
See, I left mine at the table.
Oh, and because it's on my phone, I need my glasses, so just bear with us as I look at this. Yeah, there's one there.
Great.
Yeah. What do you see as the most significant opportunity? Oh, no, that's your question.
Yeah, it is.
No, there's no questions there, so then I have one for you.
Okay.
We've sort of pre-discussed this one. But there's a lot to unpack around housing. I mean, we talk about affordable housing and how we need it, but is really just building more inventory going to solve the problem?
Yeah, housing is one of those things that everybody, as Julie said, everybody's talking about building more housing and that we're going to make housing more affordable. But when you add more inventory, for housing, when you think about housing affordability, the implicit thing is, well, housing prices are going to come down. So you have, if you do that, you have to increase the supply of housing significantly. And as soon as you start to reduce prices, you're going to wipe out a significant amount of wealth. And so this is not something that, like, you've seen a little bit of the discussion about this, is how do you reconcile affordable housing without a massive destruction in wealth for many people who've benefited from the run-up in housing prices. The other option that's out there is, well, let's just raise incomes and raise wages. That has its own challenges as well. Like, how do you raise wages by 30% or 50% without, making it, how do businesses pay for those kind of wages? So it's a really difficult challenge to deal with, and as I say, there's going to be some trade-offs. There will be winners and there will be losers. So if we really want to make housing more affordable for young people, there is going to need to be a reduction in prices, which is not necessarily something that anyone who owns a house wants to hear. But that's the reality. You can't have it both ways.
Susan, another great presentation. Thank you. My question is, has anyone actually done an analysis on what the living wage would need to be based on the current values that you've displayed? What is the living wage that's needed to live on Vancouver Island?
For those of you on the far side of the room, the question's about living wage and an analysis based on the cost of living here and what that might be.
I haven't seen anything. I know that some of the communities, I don't know if anybody from Community Futures can answer that. Is someone from Community Futures, is the living wage? Yep.
Kelly, I'll give you my mic too if you want.
What was the question? Dirk, you owe me. What was the question, sorry?
Is there any data or stats on what is the cost of, or what is the living wage for Vancouver Island?
Nothing that I've seen so far. I know that it's part of our upcoming stats and looking at that type of stuff, just because it's really hard as a small business owner to actually afford staffing as well as paying your own wage.
Absolutely.
So having a better understanding of what's required in our communities is something that we're working on actively, but nothing at the moment that I'm able to share, unfortunately.
That's great.
not really the answer everyone was looking
I
for.
really
but-
appreciate, you were put on the spot there, Kelly, so I appreciate you coming and trying your best to answer that. Are there any other questions for Susan? Oh, there is some on Slido now, I've been told, so let me take a look. I don't see it on my phone. Reload Slido. Opening Keynote. It's here now. Okay. Oh, no, that's Susan's questions again. I don't think they're going in. Does anybody want to take a mic and ask their question that they put into Slido? Because we're seeming to have some tech difficulties here. And look, Dirk's going to be my mic runner.
You're next.
Great, thanks, folks. I thought I'd address the first Living Wage BC does a survey on the actual living wage for communities, and Vancouver Island communities are included in that, and it's quite interesting, actually. So go to Living Wage BC for that. But my question was, how realistic is it to resurrect an industrial economy on Vancouver Island?
As I said, what we're seeing is we're seeing increasing services and declines in goods sector. So we need to be looking forward, not backwards. Is there a role for an industrial economy? Yes. But the future is in services, and it has been for a while, and we've been seeing those trends for a long time. Are we still going to need goods? Yes, absolutely. But we should be looking forward at technology and services. As our population grows, and if AI provides us with more leisure time, those are opportunities. What are we going to do with that leisure time? And so that's what I would say about the industrial economy. Is it going to exist, continue? Yes. But we're not going to go back to something that we haven't had realistically since the 60s.
Thanks so much, Susan. Question for you with regards to manufacturing. So considering that is an area of opportunity for us and an area that we could utilize some improvement, and thinking about the infrastructure needs for that, so would a current impediment and therefore future opportunity be investment in, say, land, sea, and air transportation and logistics?
Absolutely.
See some benefit there?
Absolutely. Like, one of the big challenges for manufacturing on Vancouver Island is logistics. And transportation. It is costly to get things to and from the island, and so being able to move things more efficiently is definitely a constraint, and an opportunity is to be able to figure out how to do that.
We'll take one more question. Oh, Dirk's doing double duty. He's photographer and mic runner. Thank you, Dirk.
Thanks for that presentation. Jesse McClinton from the Cowichan Valley Regional District. This actually ties into that question. The province gave the regional district $600,000 to get together and talk about the island rail corridor. The Stantec report that came back, few of the nations want their land back, and who can blame them? But what kind of impact could developing out that corridor have for the island?
So with the rail corridor, what you're looking at is you're looking at two things. You're looking at being able, as we have an aging population, people are going to need to move back and forth. And, you know, if you have rail, if you can do passenger rail, that is it's a relatively clean form of transportation that can be convenient. But it also is a relatively cheap way to move some goods. So it creates all sorts of opportunities, and it can, alleviate some of the truck traffic and that on the island, on the island corridor, and make it easier for where there is industrial land available to be able to connect with some of the more urban areas. So it does just kind of, it's a foundational piece of infrastructure that can lower costs. It's and enable additional activity. So.
I'm sorry, so many questions are probably hung up in Slido. Apparently they need approval, so we'll get that sorted for our next keynote. Susan's around. I'm sure she'll be happy to talk to you about her presentation, and you can find her throughout the course of the event. You now have 19 minutes before the first session begins, but let's give a huge round of applause to Susan Mowbray for her presentation.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and 2 concurrent sessions